wind up stopping. Like there's two routes, a northern route and a more southern one, I guess. We were on the more tricky one by Breckenridge or something. I think we actually pulled into the driveway of Breckenridge ski resort, I think, or similar. Wound up at a hotel overnight that they, you know, we didn't have to pay for it because the snowstorm was so bad that it tossed us off on the path there. Wind up in Salt Lake City, Utah in the middle of the night at their bus station. Then we get picked up by a shuttle that took about 2 hours to pick us up from the bus station. They're saying like an hour, hour and a half, whatever. It seemed like forever. I thought they were supposed to be there on time. We get to the CR England site where they have dorm rooms per se. Stayed there, took the whole course. They kind of intimidate people. I have a high, like technically I have a higher education than most people who would show up to drive trucks, and I was intimidated. They wanted people to read a law book and everything, and answer questions about laws, you know, related to trucking, driving. You know, it's more than just the pullover law or whatever. I forget half of them now, but it's like, this is tricky. Of course, I think a lot, so I read each question probably with 5 different perspectives in mind. So it's possible if you're a certain type of person, you would kind of know what they meant, and you would know how to answer based on like already being part of a certain mindset. But I was like, that's pretty intimidating to throw this at people and try to read a law book with all this language and rhetoric that like throws people off. I thought that was pretty sadistic, actually, of CR England. Also, is, you know, a whole bunch of things, like I couldn't upload half the things on my phone that you're supposed to sign and blah blah blah. Also, the materials for taking the test were inconsistent, so some materials were just like old school, you know, like dittos that were half erased, you know, they practically smelled like vanilla. Remember those days, you know, when dittos, you know, copies smelled like vanilla? But like one piece of paper would label things under the hood of a truck one way, and another piece of paper would label them slightly differently. And you're like, well, is it this or that? And if you don't know the parts of a vehicle or a truck, then you wouldn't be certain, you know what I mean? And being a female who only knew so much about cars, I used to not change my own oil, but I would fill my own oil, you know, and do the dipstick check and everything. I learned how to do that ages ago. But passed the test, believe it or not, even with air brakes and, you know, and trucks not being regenerated. So the air brakes, if they're drained too quickly, the trucks need to be regenerated, and the students would get yelled at. And it's like, well, the truck needs to, it's not my fault that someone who was practicing emptied the air brakes out, because they were trying to figure out how to learn how to use the air brakes. I don't see that as a fault of students, but they were very yelly type of people, whereas I'm not a yelling person. In education, you don't yell at people, you know. It's like really low class, you know. No offense, there's a lot of awesome people who have to drive trucks and they sort of put up with all this behavior and everything. Not every instructor was, you know, yelled. So anyway, somehow, you know, the written test I wasn't too afraid of, other than inconsistent study materials, but the driver's test I was afraid of in terms of parking. There's like 3 or 4 different forms of parking that you have to do in between cones, backing up the loading docks, stuff like that. I actually passed, and wound up, you know, I still have my license. It's Florida. Technically, the license itself is good till 2028, but the CDL Class A has expired. Like every 2 years, you're supposed to renew your CDL. But it's still there, and I'll keep it forever to show that that's how far I went to try to earn a living on my own, without having people who were supportive or understanding, other than my mom and aunt, who could provide a home for me to live in while I looked for work. But, you know, I was afraid to look a certain way, to say like my dad, like in their minds, in my dad and stepmom's minds, they wouldn't understand why things didn't work out. They would, it's more like they assume it's your fault. And it's like, no, actually I was raped and tortured to death. And you don't just run out and start working at the CVS or Macy's or Starbucks. And those are, you know, those are certain types of jobs, usually for certain types of people in a certain point in their lives. For someone like me, I should be in a very studious type job, writing, editing, or along the lines that's where, you know, that's commensurate with my education and experience, with mature people who handle things with, you know, tact, in a civil way, with dignity. And because of all the trauma that I've endured, I would need to have that. And someone wants to keep me down in a lower level land. No offense, you know, I don't like to classify people that way, but anyway, we'll just leave it at that. Lots of pigeonholes or cubby holes or mouse holes or whatever on this interesting home that used to be the home of Fury Design, F-U-R-Y Design. Also, I learned the word guano, which is pigeon poop. It's also, I learned it from Gabriel Kundalini, Gabriel Traveler, and it turns out it can be used for bats and pigeons. So those are the two most dominant species that the word guano is used for. I think it's guano. But anyway, lots of guano in Philly. Trust me on that one.